grateful to be among a group of people who have fought tirelessly to change the main area where psychologists have turned from our ethical obligation to do no harm and joined what we've called the dark side to actually do harm. I want to talk a little bit about the journey that we've taken, many of us together, over the past nearly 10 years. I want to talk a little bit about what makes an activist and how we become activists and what actually helps activists possibly succeed, and when do we know whether we've succeeded, because right now, at this very moment, that is the big question. Are we going to actually win this, or are we not going to win this? And I think tomorrow morning is going to be the pivotal moment in our struggle. So I want to go back to what for me was 2006. 2006, I read an article in the New York Times which said that the Department of Defense had decided to use only psychologists to run the biscuit teams. The biscuits, as most of you know, were the behavioral science consultants who were supervising these abusive interrogations that the International Committee of the Red Cross had called tantamount to torture. And suddenly, in the midst of all these scandals, the Army decided to prioritize psychologists as the ones to oversee these nefarious interrogations. That single article turned me from someone who was aghast at everything I'd read, who was upset about the Penn's report, who was devastated to learn that health professionals were at all involved at Guantanamo and elsewhere. But suddenly, something seemed terribly wrong with the American Psychological Association and with my profession, that we had worked so hard to be the priority, the ones chosen to do this terrible work. And I actually wrote what now I see as a naive letter to the president of the American Psychological Association, Gerald Kuchar. And I said, you probably don't understand what this means and how it's being perceived by the public and what it means for our profession. And he wrote back in a rather curt letter saying something like, don't believe everything you read in the press. And so that began my activism, and I began to speak out. I turned into something, one of the spokespeople to investigate what was actually going on with psychology, what actually had happened on the Penn's task force. And like, I guess, the Brementown musicians, a group of us eventually came together, and we discovered that we were united in being horrified about what had happened to our profession. And I want to give a special thanks to Physicians for Human Rights in the organization of us, because they were much clearer than I was about what was going on and why it was going on and what had to happen. And they found all the disparate psychologists who had done something to protest this and got us on the phone together and helped us organize our protests. And we worked at that time for years. Jean Maria Rigo was a courageous whistleblower and gave us the documents. We exposed the documents. We exposed what the APA was doing. We fought them at every turn. But for most of that time, they got the better of us. And many of us were ready to give up. But somehow or other, and I have to say, and Stephen Saltz and I have said this to one another a few times, we thought we had lost. We thought it was over. We thought we played just about every card we had. We knew that there was one card left to play, and we kind of had a hope that it would have an impact, but we were somewhat disillusioned. It didn't stop us. We fought everything that came out, every policy, every rationale, every press release at the APA, one of us, and when we flagged, there were others in the coalition, Roy Idelson in particular, who kept the energy up and continued the fight so that somebody was holding that candle to light the way so that we wouldn't give up hope. But we thought we had lost. And the one card that was left is that we knew that Jim Reisner was writing a book. And we knew that in that book there was going to be a chapter that was going to address our concerns, and that somehow or other, Jim Reisner had gotten hold of some of these emails that actually seemed to provide evidence for what we had always said and what we had always argued, and that was that the Penn's task force was a group of carefully chosen military and CIA psychologists who came together for one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to align APA's ethics policy with DOD's interrogation policy and the CIA's interrogation policy and the Bush administration's interrogation policy, which we know and knew was a torture policy. So Jim Reisner published his book, and the APA tried its old tactics of dismissing it and saying that all of the evidence had been refuted and that it was nonsense and hearsay. But there were the emails, and there was the absolute, direct, primary evidence. And so we discovered that we hadn't lost. But in fact, the tables were turned, and we and you pressured the APA and embarrassed the APA and forced the APA to call for an independent investigation. And many people in the APA believed that this investigation was going to prove once and for all that we were a bunch of blowhards, we were a bunch of conspiracy theorists, that we were going to once and for all be shut up. But we knew the truth, and we knew what was coming, and we were ready. And in fact, Stephen and I wrote a letter to the board just before the Hoffman report was going to come out, and we told them, listen, we know what this report is going to say. You may be in doubt. You may think that it's going to exonerate the APA, but this is going to be the biggest bioethics scandal since the Tuskegee experiments. And if you want the APA to survive, please let us help you. And lo and behold, the board realized that APA was in trouble. And they must have been told by the Hoffman crew that something serious was coming down the line, because they asked us to come and meet with them and to tell them what we thought, A, what this meant, because we'd been studying it for 10 years and we'd been talking about it for 10 years, and they were in shock. Denial doesn't prepare you for when the bad news hits. And the American Psychological Association and most of its council and all of its board and most of its members were in denial about its own history and its own collusion in these abusive interrogation techniques and ultimately in torture. So suddenly the tables had turned. Suddenly the Hoffman report was out. What we had been saying for 10 years was the case was acknowledged, and evidence was provided that in fact it was the case. And the tables were turned, and we thought we had won. And I want to say that in the same way that I said we thought we had lost, because we cannot yet assume that we have won this battle. And I want to remind all of us about what this battle is about. This battle is a battle to transform the American Psychological Association and what it represents away from the denial and wink and nod acceptance of torture and abuse, to make it responsible, make it accountable, and in so doing, remind the American people and the American government and every other organization that the United States has yet to take an accounting for its part in the torture program, for its part in making torture more acceptable throughout the world, that we haven't taken full responsibility for that. The APA taking full responsibility would be the first step. And where do we stand? Okay, it's true that the major players are gone or about to be gone. It is true that the APA has acknowledged to the country and the world that they were part of a collusion to align APA policy with DOD policy. But what Stephen and I told the board when we were there was that it was going to take more than a little bit of acknowledgement and then calling for a healing and moving on, because that's not enough. We outlined a number of steps that were necessary, painful steps that were necessary for this to be turned around. And those steps, some have been taken somewhat, but the important ones and the hard ones haven't been taken. APA has shown contrition. I'm very glad to see that the ones involved and the leaders of the APA have apologized to us. They've apologized to the public and the membership for denying their collusion and for what was revealed in the Hoffman report. They have held a few people accountable, particularly, I think, 4. What they have not done yet, and what is absolutely necessary, is for the American Psychological Association to undergo a thorough, profound self-examination that they don't do just by themselves, but they bring in outsiders to help them with, to understand the culture of power, the culture of manipulation, the culture of deceit that was rife throughout the APA for that entire period and until the Hoffman report was released, that permitted this kind of duplicity, this kind of collusion, this kind of deceit, and this kind of manipulation to have gone on for so long, and to have those people remain in power continuing to do it from the beginning until very, very recently. They have to expose what was wrong at the heart of the APA power structure that allowed that to happen. That's one thing they need to do. They need to review entirely their ethics code, their ethics office, their ethical responsibility. Because instead of being a leader in telling health professionals how to behave ethically, independent of government, independent of profit, independent of pressure, they made it possible for psychologists to wiggle out of ethical responsibility. They refused to hold anybody accountable, and they made the language vague so that there were loopholes galore so psychologists could continue to do this. So their ethics policy has to be reviewed, redone. Their ethics office has to be reorganized. Their ethics code has to be reviewed from the ground up. They not only have to hold the association accountable, but I think individuals who are responsible also need to be held accountable. But more important, and this is the key that we are trying to, which will mean whether we win this or we lose this, and that has to do with whether or not APA will once and for all change its policy on the role of psychologists in national security interrogations and detentions, and in places where detainees are held in violation of the United Nations Convention against torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Right now, there are psychologists at Guantanamo Bay, and they're not only doing therapy. Psychologists are involved in the force feeding of detainees who are on hunger strikes, the force feeding of detainees who are on voluntary hunger strikes is a violation of international law. Nobody has called out those psychologists or any of the other health professionals to say you are in violation of international law. You are participating in causing or perpetuating harm. So we have to make sure that APA goes from leading us into the dark side, leading us into the torture room, leading us into the use of psychology for abuse. We have to turn APA to leading the way out of the interrogation room, out of the violation of international human rights. Psychologists have got to be the leaders now in transforming the role of health professionals away from standing by or perpetuating human rights violations into holding a standard that says no. We will not be present at places where this happens. If we are, we will protest it and leave. It has to be a clear policy, which we've written. Dan Albers, Scott Churchill, Jean Maria Arrigo, with my help, have written a very comprehensive policy. This policy prohibits psychologists from being present at sites that violate international law, from participating in national security interrogations, from overseeing national security detention sites when they exist to promote intelligence gathering or interrogations. This is a good policy. But tomorrow, the American Psychological Association Council of Representatives has to vote on this policy. And I can tell you its passage is by no means assured. I don't know how it's possible, given what we know, given what the lessons we've learned, but yes, it is possible. And people are saying that for various reasons, there are council members who are nervous about upholding these human rights standards. There are council members who are afraid that somehow, I don't know what, we will be in a leadership role. We will be calling the United States to account. We will be upholding our ethical obligations to say no when asked to harm. Is that what they're afraid of? Well, it's your job to go and find those council members, to talk to them, and to let them know that the reputation of American psychology is on the line, that how we hold, the way we believe, whether we trust the American Psychological Association to do good and not harm is dependent on whether they will learn from the scandal embodied in the Hoffman report. It is up to you to go there tomorrow, to go there tonight. Find your council members. Tell them how strongly you feel. Tell them that the survival of the American Psychological Association is at stake. Tell them that the reputation of the profession is at stake. Tell them that the honor of America as an upholder of human rights is dependent on their leading the way as a model for the rest of the country. Thank you.